Aloha, this is Jason from Hawaii. Welcome to a very special edition of the Comics for Fun and Profit podcast. In this episode, it is my honor, to be interviewing, these two writers, Richard Arndt and Steve Thiers. They are here to promote their new book, Our Artists at War, the best of the best American war comics, and it's from Tomorrow's Publishing. Now, the previews code, and I hope I got this right, it's JUL212065. Now, I know this book, if I remember correctly, I think this book is supposed to be coming out sometime in October or early November. Let's see. Richard and Steve, how are you guys doing today?
Just fine. I'm doing good. Richard, how about you?
I'm doing fine also.
Of course, all right. He's clear in Nevada, and I'm here in Oklahoma.
All right. No, thank you very much, guys. Okay. Now, before I begin, before I get started to go over Richard and Steve's history, I did not plan this. It must have been by fate. But today is September 18th, and it is Joe Kubert's birthday.
Oh.
No,
I hadn't remembered. Oh, that's fortuitous.
Yes.
I hope, since he did the cover for the book.
Yes.
So I just thought that was very incredible, and I just want to point that out to listeners.
Oh, he's always been one of my favorite artists.
Oh, yes, yes.
Mine as well.
All right, so Richard, I'm going to give a little bit of history of your work. So Richard, you have done, and Richard, correct me if I'm wrong, you have done the Star Reach Companion. It's from Tomorrow's Publishing, that was published back in 2013.
Yes.
You've done now another book called Horror Comics in Black and White: A History and Catalog. And it's from the time period of 1964 to 2004. And that's from the McFarlane and Company. And that was published back in 2013. Okay. And then I know also too, Richard, correct me if I'm wrong, you also have done a book of poetry that, and it's called On Lazy Man Hill. That was published in 1999. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then if people are interested, if listeners are interested in checking that poetry book out, where can they get that from?
Well, it's long out of print as far as bookstores go, but they can get a copy. I still have copies, and if they're interested, they can look up my name, Richard Arndt, on Facebook and send me a message.
Okay. All right,
I'll
Richard.
get hold of it.
Okay. And then Richard, I'm going to continue on. Okay. Now you've done 100 of interviews and articles for Tomorrow's books. Some of them, are war related. Now, currently, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's a back issue magazine issue that's going to be either out in stores or coming out very soon, and it's going to be on Jack Kirby's Black Magic and Boy Commandos revival in the 70s. Is that correct?
Yes, that'll be back issue 131, supposed to come out next month.
Oh, okay. And then also too, you've also written for Alter Ego magazine, and that and you wrote nearly a magazine-length piece on legendary artists, and I'm going to try to pronounce the artist name correctly as best I can, Alfredo Alcala. Is that correct?
Alcala.
Alcala. Yeah. And then for younger listeners, I remember Alfred's work when he did Conan. Is that correct?
Yes, but he also had a long career in the Philippines, nearly a 25-year career that almost no one in the United States has seen the artwork for, which with this will have a lot of his artwork from that period.
Okay. I'm going to ask for that Alter Ego issue. Has that already been out, or is it going to be coming out soon?
No, it's coming out again next month. It's issue 172.
Oh, okay. All right.
Next month being October of 2021.
Okay. All right. And then also in the Comic Book Creator, you have a regular column, and it's called Graphic Novels in the Library. Is that correct?
Yes, it appears every issue.
Okay. And then, Richard, did I miss anything?
I don't believe so. I think that covers me.
Okay. Now, Steve, um,
Yes.
I'm going to go over your works. And like I said, please correct me if I'm wrong. Now,
Okay.
one of the things that I came across was that you and Richard wrote a tribute to Sam Glasman in Alter Ego magazine, issue 152 from Tomorrow's Publishing. That was back in 2017. It was titled Last of the Lions.
Yes.
Okay. And then also to Steve, you have an incredible list of works. And correct me if I'm wrong. So, okay, you've contributed to the following: the Overstreet's Gold and Silver Quarterly.
Yes. Many years ago.
Okay. Comic Book Marketplace.
Yes, I did a few things for that magazine.
Okay. And then you've also contributed to Alter Ego magazine.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
You've worked with the late, I'm going to try to pronounce his name, the late Billy Shelley. Is that correct?
Yes, Bill Shelley. Yes.
So for listeners, Mr. Shelley and Steve, correct me if I'm wrong. Mr. Shelley was an Eisner Award-winning author who chronicled the history of comic books and comic book fandom. And he also wrote a few biographies on Joe Kubert and Harvey Kurtzman.
Yes.
Okay. And then also too, now correct me if I'm wrong, you contribute to this incredible book, We Spoke Out, Comic Books and the Holocaust. And that's from Yo Books, that was published back in 2018. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then you've also contributed to the Sam Glasman collections.
Oh, yes. Uh-huh.
Okay.
I actually had some of his unpublished artwork and was able to loan those to the Dover Books so they could publish one of the stories for the first time.
Wow, that's incredible. Also too, you've interviewed legendary artists such as Russ Heath and Dick Ayers for the Comic Book Buyer's Guide, or the Comics Buyer's Guide, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay. And then also you did self-publishing. You self-published 2 magazines in CD form.
Yes.
Is the first one called Panographic?
Panel, one was Mastermind,
yes,
which was a revival of an old fanzine from many back years ago, back in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
The other one was Panelography.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Okay.
Yes. It doesn't roll off the tongue that easily.
Don't worry. Don't worry. Sorry about that, but thank you for the correct pronunciation. But for those magazines, you've interviewed Rick Estrada,
yes,
Gene Colan, Mark Drucker, just to name a few.
Yes, Jerry Grandinetti.
Okay.
Yes.
And then also you're also a member of the Big Five collections, and you also contribute to the Big Five information guide. Is that correct?
Yes, Chris Pedron, and I know Richard, has a copy of that also. I'm pretty sure you do, don't you, Richard?
Yes, I do. It's one of the best reference books I've got on war.
Oh, it's indispensable, and it is very hard to find these days.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Right. But I contributed some information to that, and just the Big Five collectors, and through them, I think we connected to Richard. Richard connected to us, and I think I'm correct there.
Actually, I bought some of his panelology books.
Yes.
Magazines. And that's how I first became acquainted with him, but it took a couple of years after that. Well, it took a number of years after that for us to actually become acquainted.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank goodness for emails and things like that, and a common love of the DC War comics to start with.
Oh
yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, Steve, did I miss anything?
No, that's pretty it. I'm sure there's a few things here and there. As far as who I've contributed to, I've done, contributed scans of a lot of covers and artwork, and for some of those Bill Shelley's books and a few other people too. So it's just, like I said, a kind of background kind of stuff to help out some of those books and things.
I think it should also be noted that he probably did 80% of the scans on our book as well.
Okay. Yes.
That was extremely helpful. I don't think I contributed nearly as much, but.
Oh, well, I was just lucky to have all those things.
All right. Now, before we get started in the interview, I want to give a big shout out to John Morrow of Tomorrow's Publishing.
Oh, yes.
He was the one who helped coordinate this interview. So, John, thank you very much. Richard, Steve, do you guys want to give a shout out to John or add anything to that?
Well, we know for myself, and I won't speak for Richard, but I'm very appreciative of him liking our book, and having enough faith to want to publish it.
The acceptance of the book was delayed for over a year because of COVID and because everybody had to shut down.
Yeah,
including John. His entire outfit shut down. So he couldn't make any guarantees, because I think I only broached the idea with him about a month before COVID came. And so it was delayed for well over a year, but once he made his mind up, it was like that. And he wanted it right away. And I appreciated that, because that's someone who's enthusiastic about what you're working on. And that's a nice thing to know. Before he even got into he made some he also changed our title. He was the one who provided the title we're using, because our original title was The Real Big Five. And he came up with a better title, which I have no problem with whatsoever. So, and another thing that might be of interest is that we have a Joe Kubert original piece of art of Joe Kubert's that was never published. It was done in 1964 for what was supposed to be a G.I. Joe comic. That never got off the ground, and that was supposed to be the cover for the first one. And that was John got that from John Cook, who's the editor of Comic Book Creator, and everybody was helping out on this. It was a very nice, welcome, friendly thing that it all came together very, very quickly and very nicely, I think. I love the cover, and I love the way that they worked on it and made it look really snazzy. So.
Oh, yes, I just a shout out to the designer of the book too. Just I think saw things in it that we hadn't envisioned yet, and I think everyone, when they see the book, will be very pleased with it. But he arranged all the elements on the cover, and it just looks spectacular.
And not just the cover, the interior pages have art design all through them, and they look really nice.
Oh, it's like I said, I know we didn't envision just how each page would lay out as you turn to read or look at the artwork, but it turned out so much better than I even thought it would. And, I think Richard and I are both very, very pleased with with how it all turned out.
So our shout out isn't just to John Morrows, but to everybody who worked on the book at this point, because they all did and came through with some really nice stuff, which we would not have had access to in many cases. So thank you, everybody.
Yes.
I have to say that's really nice that John, because the title, Our Artists at War, when I heard about the title, I'm sorry, I'm kind of going off a little bit, and I'll get back to the questions, because all I remember was that nice little trade paperback, correct me if I'm wrong, it was from, I think, the late 70s, Our Army at War, the DC trade with like of course Sergeant Rock,
that was the Fireside book, I believe.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It was a compilation of their best works.
Yes.
At that point in time.
Let me interject real quick. The designer of our book is Scott Saadvedra. Hope I'm saying that right. And a big shout out to him.
Yes, and he was in communication with us quite frequently while he
Yes.
was working on it, and that was enormously helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Allowing us to have our input on his work. I think, even though I don't know if we had that big of an impact on his work,
no.
it was nice to be considered. That does not always happen in publishing. So.
I'm sure he had to do with, with the cover layout and the lettering, logo, and all that. I mean, he really came through and working with John, and it just surprised us, in a good way.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I just wanted to interject that.
No, that's fine. That's fine. No. Now, before I start getting to the meat and potatoes of the interview, I also want to give a couple shout outs. I want to give a shout out to Michael Cronenberg and also John Sanchez of Word Balloon. Now, Michael, I know he works for Ringside Magazine. I just want to give a big shout out to Michael and John, because this is how I found out about your guys' book. I saw it on Twitter. They're retweeting this. So that's how I knew I heard about your guys' book, and I was going, I need to talk to you guys. So yeah.
Well, thank them from us too, because I like the idea of us being out on Twitter, since I'm not a Twitter person whatsoever. So.
Nor am I. I'm barely Facebook. Let me say that.
Now, before I continue, I'm just gonna ask, since we're kind of going over the social media stuff, Richard, where can listeners follow you?
They can go on Facebook and pull my name up. It's Richard Arndt, and it would be the Nevada address. The Nevada address should pull up, and that's there. I know there are a number of Richard Arndts on Facebook, surprisingly, because I don't think that's a common name. But if they look for one that's in Nevada, that would be me.
Okay.
I look like Michael Douglas in Ant-Man.
Okay.
I hear that a lot.
And Steve, what about you?
I do have a Facebook page, which is probably under Stephen, or it might be under my first name, George Fears.
Okay.
So, but I'm, like I said, I'm not a big Facebook person. I'm more of I'll wish people happy birthday on their Facebook page, and I'll look at mine occasionally. But I did, in all defense of Facebook, went ahead, and I know Richard did too. We both put up the images of our book so people could see it, and it would go out to not only our friends but other people, and maybe be picked up and echoed through other people that are on Facebook. So,
and as we get closer to publication day, I have my family and everybody they know primed to put the book image up on Facebook and up on Twitter and up on any other social organization, and say, spread this around as much as you can, because I think that's kind of what you really have to do nowadays, is provide much of the advertising as you can yourself.
Oh, yes.
And
that's why we appreciate what you're doing right now.
Right. That's exactly what you're doing at this particular moment too. Oh, and you were talking earlier about the publication date. I believe it's the 19th is what I have down, October 19th.
Oh, okay.
Or tomorrow's, but Amazon is putting it out November 2nd.
Yeah.
A number of comic book companies are putting it out on the 19th or 20th. So there's a little bit of difference in what date it goes on sale.
Yes. So yeah.
But I think we're having, it's being, I believe, and Richard, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's being printed in China. So it will
I'm
be
sure it is, yes.
coming by ship, so, and I know there's a real backlog of, of ships, off the West Coast and getting through, port of entry and customs and everything else. So
all of that,
I understand, things are delayed.
Yeah.
So we're keeping our fingers crossed that it shows up when it's supposed to.
Well, Richard and Stephen, like I said, just thank you very much for coming on the show. Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you guys, about war comics. I mean, I only can speak for myself, and I know, and I pretty much know there's probably like, and I'm sure there's a lot of other old, I'm going to say old readers, longtime readers, that remember reading Sergeant Rock comics, the DC War comics,
Mm-hmm.
the Charleston comics. So just, again, thank you for giving me the opportunity to interview you guys. Okay, so I'm going to start asking, where did you guys grow up?
Oh, Richard, you want to go first?
No, you go ahead and I'll come in. I've been going first too many times already.
Oh, actually, like I said, I live in Oklahoma City. I grew up here, and then there's a town north of Oklahoma City called Edmond, where I moved to when I was probably in about the 3rd or 4th grade. And that's mainly where I grew up. But we had good drugstores that had nice spinner racks that sold all the comics. And I actually kind of lived out in the country just a little bit, but I had a bicycle and and a little money in my pocket, and I could, I remember buying, all the Amazing Fantasy, especially when Spider-Man first came out, and I'd buy the DC War comics and their science fiction comics. I mean, Adam Strange was always one of my favorites, so, and the Flash, of course, and Justice League, and so there's just, and then all the Marvel monster comics, and then all of a sudden Fantastic Four showed up on the spinner rack. So I became a Marvel fan at that point too. So, and I guess we were very lucky in the amount of comic books that were available back then. I mean, the war comics are always my first love, but then the science fiction and then the superhero, every week there was always something.
Mm-hmm.
So, growing up, I just, I think my first comic book I ever bought was Uncle Scrooge number 11. So, that was, the great Carl Barks, although we didn't know it was him back then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But then I started noticing artwork like by Joe Kubert and Russ Heath, and then all the Del War comics with Sam Glansman's work, and just you start expanding your reading subjects around that time. So being 12 years old and all those comics, it was just amazing back then.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I've always been I've been a fan ever since. Never thought about, giving them up or quit reading them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So anyway, Richard?
I grew up in Michigan, Big Rapids area, about 50 miles north of Grand Rapids. I lived there for my first 22 years, and then I moved out west and haven't really looked back too much except for a short period. I got started in comics pretty much the same way that Steve did, I guess. We had drugstores, Rexall drugstores, I remember in particular, had a good spinner section and a good black and white magazine section. And then there was a big drugstore across town by the Kroger store that had every comic book you could ask for 1 week. And if you didn't get it that week, it was gone the next week.
Mm-hmm.
That was common back then. And then across from my grandfather's, there was a store, Hall's grocery store. And on the window, I don't know if I should say this the way it is, but on the window, they had 3 comics for $0.25 with the top half of the cover cut off. These were illegal comics, which I didn't know at the time. They were they were sold by the distributor illegally to stores to make some money that they didn't have to report back to anybody.
Yes.
And the weird thing is those comics were sitting there, and in between, next to them on this big long shelf was a row of coverless paperbacks from exactly the same reason.
Mm-hmm.
And right next to that was the porn aisle.
Yes.
Where they had all the porn books with the covers on them, wrapped in plastic so you couldn't read them. But any kid who was up there was looking at them because they were drawn exactly the same way as a black and white comic was.
Mm-hmm.
often by the same artist. So
Yeah.
you know, it was an education and a fun to pick out the comics, but an education to walk over there and pay for them. You think, I don't want mom to walk over there and see all that stuff because I'll never be allowed to buy comics here again. So you had to be careful. But
yeah.
And I like the same stuff. You didn't know who the artists were back then because they weren't usually identified, but you could open up a book and say, oh, that's Jack Kirby and that's Neil Adams. I like his stuff, and I like Jim Aparo, and I like Joe Kubert, and I really, really like Russ Heath and Sam Gladsman and all that stuff. So you knew who they were even if you didn't know their names.
Yeah, you knew the style.
Yep. There was a point in time when I could identify every artist and every inker working in the business during the late 60s, early 70s. Wow. Just by looking at the page. I can actually still do that most of the time if you show me a comic from that era. Or advertising art, because a lot of advertising art today is taken from those old comics, not from new stuff. So I would look at like a calendar and say, well, that's George Tuska being inked by, I'm going to say Johnny Craig. And I'll be right 80% of the time, probably more. But I bet Steve could do the same thing.
Yeah, you just got used to, I like this. You didn't know who it was. But every once in a while, you'd come across their name. They signed it once in a while. Like Grandinetti would sign some of his Washtone covers. And Russ Heath always signed his work, and Joe Kubert did too.
Yes.
But then you got used to Andrew and Esposito or Jack Abel or Mort Drucker or some of their work. But, we're at the right age that in the early 60s was, I know they call it the silver age, but to me it was my golden age. But that's probably the best time for comic books to be on the stands. Creepy and eerie magazines started showing up. All the Edgar Rice Burroughs paperbacks that were being published with the Frank Frazetta covers, and the reprints of that Ballantine Books did of all the EC comics, and they're in black and white. But that was such a rich time of reading material. I mean, you'd go to a newsstand every week and there were the Burroughs paperbacks or comics or a new issue of Creepy and then Blazing Combat, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But, it was such a great time to be a kid discovering, and then all the new superheroes, and then Captain America's revived, and then there's the Justice League, and then the team ups of, like Flash and Green Lantern. I mean, it was and Richard, was probably like me. You go every week, the first Superman annual. My goodness, that was wonderful. And then the first Batman annual. You're going, gee, there was a golden age. Yeah. And then fanzines came out because Marvel and the Julia Schwartz both published, letters to the editor, and they had addresses and people's names, So I sent off for a sample of, I think it was the original Alter Ego #4 with Ron Foss's artwork on the cover. So, I mean, those were great times, and that's where we probably both kind of discovered fandom and collecting, and conventions started happening. So, I mean, it was a great time. I don't mean to hog the conversation here, but
you're not.
Richard was just as awestruck as I was.
You're basically telling my life story there.
Like I said, it was great being a kid back then because there was something wonderful every week.
That's exactly true. And one of the things you got used to doing every week was knowing exactly what day they were putting out new stuff.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Now these days,
that's record keeping for a 12 or 11-year-old kid.
Oh,
that's record keeping. That's a valuable lesson.
Yeah. And see, back then, magazines came out on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Yep.
So you got it twice in a week. There'd be a bundle of Wired comic books, and you couldn't wait for them to, snip that wire.
But never take the first top copy because there's always the damage. The wire always cut into the top copy.
Oh, yes.
So
Uh,
it went down 4 or 5 issues.
Yeah. Like I said, I remember when, Superman Annual came out, #1. I mean, that was just, your eyes just got big.
mhm.
It was just so, so wonderful to see the old stuff that we hadn't really been aware of. So,
Yeah, that's true. Very few reprints back in the 60s.
oh
my-
yeah.
mhm. So I'm going to ask. This is off the cuff question, and slowly we'll get into the book and so forth. Do you guys still have any of your old comics?
I have some, but not very many. Like many kids, at one point, my parents tossed a lot of my stuff. And some of them, I bought Silver Surfer 1. It was the first time I'd ever spent that much money on a comic book. It was 25 cents.
Mm-hmm.
And I bought it from the grocery store. And I thought my mother will kill me if she knows I spent a whole quarter. Because back then, a quarter, you could get 5 bottles of pop with a quarter.
Mm-hmm.
You could get 5 candy bars with a quarter.
Mm-hmm.
You could get 2 regular comic books, and I had bought 1.
Yeah.
And that one wore out. That one actually literally fell apart. I read it so many times and had it for so long that eventually, back then, if it wore out, you scrapped it.
Yeah.
And this one was literally, I don't think there was a single page at a certain point that was connected to the other page.
Mm-hmm.
But
I still have my war comics, and I still have that Uncle Scrooge #11. I did keep that. But over the time, I wish I still had my, Spider-Man 1 and Fantastic Four 1. Back then, I sold them. You don't even want to know how much we sold them for.
no.
But cheap would be a good way to describe it.
And you also traded a lot.
Oh, mm-hmm.
And so if you bought it, you may trade it to somebody else because you thought you'd got all the juice out of it you were going to get out of it from rereading it again. And then you'd think back 6 months later, man, I wish I still had that comic around.
Mm-hmm.
You could buy old EC comics for $2 from Howard Rogofsky,
Mm-hmm.
who was a big dealer back then.
That's how I bought all my Iron Fist comics when John Byrne was drawing it.
Oh my God. So wait, Richard, do you still have that?
No, I wish I did.
Okay, I was like,
those were among the ones that vanished when I was in college. Clearing out the basement. He says, "Well, he's not reading these anymore."
Yeah.
No, that's the way it goes.
Oh yeah.
I'm not the only kid who lost their collection because mom was house cleaning. So.
Yeah. Well, but I'm going to say, I think the cool thing is that Richard and Steve, you guys, what it was, you guys enjoyed comics. You read, like you said, you read Silver Surfer #1 till literally the pages were falling off because that's the joy of what comics really should be. Whereas for me, when I grew up in the 70s and actually in the 80s, when you start hearing that, what do you mean I could sell my comics and get twice as much or 3 times or 4 times or whatever, it's then that's where sometimes that then for me the habit was, okay, if I now I got to buy 2 copies of, and I'm going to say the first time I ever bought 2 copies of anything was Crisis on Infinite Earths #1. So I think if I remember when that came out, it was 50 cents. Instead of spending 50 cents, I spent $1. So but one a reading copy and one to save and hopefully one day sell it off one day at a much higher price. But just listening to you guys talk about just growing up, just the nostalgic, just going to the drugstore, the grocery store, just to buy comics and just reading them. It sounds great.
Well,
yeah, you can't do anything like that today.
Yeah.
But I mean, the 60s was a time of, a lot of pop culture. People become. Think about it, the Beatles. When they came out, all of a sudden you're just becoming more aware of the world, and comics were exciting to read, and And like I said, all the Burroughs paperbacks, all of a sudden there's just such a richness of, you know, music and reading materials and stuff like that. And plus, you know, I was going to say a lot of history going on at that time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, that was a turbulent time period too with the Vietnam War, but there was, I think, you know, we were all discovering, you know, ourselves then. And so, and comics were just part of me, you know,
Mm-hmm.
growing up. So, and I never forgot that or left it.
Mm-hmm.
I honestly think comics helped me learn how to read in the first place. I vividly remember the first comic I could actually read.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember the issue, and I don't remember the year,
Mm-hmm.
but it had to be very early because it was a Wyatt Earp comic, and I know who drew it. It was Dick Ayers, and I can still see it in my head.
Mm-hmm.
And that had to be 57, 58, and I was born in 56, so I probably read it a few years later, but
Mm-hmm.
I was reading before I went into kindergarten.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah, I think
it took me to like first grade before it finally dawned on me that those little arrows pointing off the word balloons were pointing to the person who was talking. That was a big revelation for me.
Mm-hmm.
Once I got that, I got the whole system down. I was very happy that day because, you know, okay, the little dots go to the person who's thinking, the little arrow goes to the person who's talking.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
I mean, I think I learned to read almost the same way. I think, you know, my mother would read a comic book to me and she'd say, well, here, read this. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and plus I just learned to have a love of reading and visual arts. I became an art teacher because of comic books,
Mm-hmm.
because, you know, but yeah, I mean, if you like comics, you're going to learn to read.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So I look at it as an educational tool also.
I think both of us found out naturally what it took 5 decades for teachers to finally figure out.
Yes.
Because that's the honest to God truth. Nowadays, they're completely comfortable with kids reading comics, graphic novels in school.
Yeah.
But that was a fight, man.
Graphic storytelling wasn't quite as accepted back then as it is.
It was
now.
actually frowned upon. You used to have it taken away from you, and you would get in trouble for reading a comic book in school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
EC Comics had comic book had a cover that looked like a school notebook. So
yeah, they got in big trouble for that too.
Yeah.
The city of New York was considering suing them over that because so many kids were sneaking their Mad magazine in there under the cover of it being a school notebook. And that's a true story.
Mm-hmm. So Richard and Steve, I'm sorry, this is one question I forgot to write down for you guys, both of you guys. So what was the journey for you guys? And if you don't mind just talking about your careers, how did you guys get to the point where you guys are like interviewing comic book creators, you know, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm saying this wrong, like illustrated books for like Tomorrow's Publishing. How did you guys get these jobs, or as freelance writers? How did you guys start getting work into, I guess, part of the comic book industry?
You want to go first, or you want me to?
Richard, why don't you go ahead and go first?
I think, and I've told many people this, it was by the back door. Unlike Steve, I had no connection with fandom whatsoever. No connection with comic book conventions. I didn't even know they existed till I was like 19 or 20.
Mm-hmm.
And it was years after that, and I went into this bookstore in Salt Lake City where they had flat, unread, never before touched copies of Creepy and Eerie from the Frazzetti days, the early days, the 67, 64, 65, and a bunch of Skywalls. None of them, they were all file copies that had been sold to this bookstore in lieu of payment for something else. And so they had been, and the comic book shop had closed down in, I'm going to say 1978, when the brother ran the bookstore, but the other brother ran the comic book store, and he died. And they didn't get any new comics, and they just closed the room up. And I said, that room's full of comics. Can I go in and look at it? He says, oh, sure, go ahead. And I walk in and there's all these file copies of stuff. And they're perfectly flat. They're the top issues were dusty because they'd had probably 20 years of dust on them. And I took them and bought them. And I looked them up on the Grand Comic Book Database and discovered that they didn't have very good records of them at that time. And they didn't, and some of what they did was completely wrong. I could look at this and know that they were completely wrong. They didn't match what was in the book for one thing, but they didn't also match what I could actually see with my own eyes. Because like I said, I could identify the penciler and the art and the inker by looking at the page. And so I wrote to the Grand Comic Book Database and said, look, you've got bad information or no information here, and I know it all. And they says, well, fill these out. So I filled out, and if you go on a Grand Comic Book Database, 90% of the information on the creepy books is from me. And nearly all of the Skywald stuff is from me. Now, some of it was incorrect on my part because I didn't have complete records. And people were using fake names on some of it. But 90% of it was correct. And I did that. And one of the things is that shortly thereafter, Al Hewitson, who used to be the editor of Skywald, contacted me. And he says, I was the first person who'd ever went to that much trouble to get all that stuff down. I said, well, thank you. And he says, do you happen to know where this particular artist is? Because I would like to get together with him and work on something again. And I says, no, I did not know where this artist was. I knew his name, but I didn't. It was Malio Citron. And he actually was doing, at that time, I think he was painting Star Trek paperback covers.
Oh, yeah.
But I didn't know that because, of course, they're not identified on most of the paperbacks. They don't have the cover artist identified on them. But 2 weeks after that, I got a letter from Malio Citron, who says, I would like to know if you could put me in touch with Al Hewitson. I says, well, yes, I could do that, because he just contacted me. So I got them in touch with each other, and unfortunately, Al died very shortly thereafter. But I was one of the last people he was emailing, because we were emailing back and forth the day before he died, and apparently, actually the day he died, and he passed away that evening. Probably within a few minutes after I had sent him back an email. So his wife contacted me. And from that, I started, I'd done a short little interview with him, because I thought, I'm going to put this up online, and I'll put this little interview I did with Al Hewitson. It was a terrible interview. I didn't have no idea what to ask. And it was not, I look at it today and I kind of cringe, to tell you the truth. But, it was a first effort, and I didn't know what I was doing. So the fact that I actually got it finished and got it up was good.
Yes.
And then other people started contacting me. Professionals, almost always professionals. Like I knew something, and I really didn't know anything. But I thought, well, maybe if they think I'm doing good, I should send these out to some of these magazines. So I tried Comic Book Artist and got nowhere. And I tried Roy Thomas and got nowhere. Until one day I sent him an interview I'd done for a fanzine, the Bar Mitzvah. I don't know if you ever heard that, but there were a number of fanzine people who did actual comic books with professional artists, Bernie Wrightson and Mike Kaluta and Jeff Jones and people like that. But they were kids. They were teenagers, 14, 15 years old, who used their bar mitzvah money to put out a comic book or two. And I interviewed them, and Roy said, well, this isn't half bad. So can we use this? And I said, yeah, use it away. I'm not going to say no. And that's how I got into it, is that Roy Thomas gave me my first break, because he saw some value in something that I would have done differently if I were doing it today. But back then, you're playing it by ear. So, and that just spiraled around. Pretty soon I was doing a lot of stuff for Roy. And I mean, quite a lot. I'm always surprised how, but the first thing is I knew he liked my stuff, because he sent and said, I would like you to write a long piece on the comics code and how it affected comics. And I thought, first off, he's testing me to see if I'll do it and how well I'll do it. And second, he says, I'd be stupid not to do this, because this is really my way in if I want to keep doing this. And three, I have no idea how to do this. But I did it anyway, and it turned out pretty darn good. And it not only took up almost a full issue of Alter Ego, but he did a sequel to it a few months later, about a year later. And so I did that too. And I think that him doing that bar mitzvah boy stuff, and then actually commissioning me to do something, as of before I was just sending stuff in, and he would say no, yes, and that was it. But since then, he asked for something, I do it. If I send something in, he says, yeah, we can run this. And that's a great relationship to have. So, and then by that time, comic book artist was dead, but comic book creator had been created. So it was a sequel. And back issue, I started doing a little bit of stuff for them. And I did the 2 books. And that was the easiest 2 books I ever got published. I tried for years after that to get a 3rd book published, and it was difficult. This is my 4th book, but the 3rd book that I actually got going. And I'm very grateful for that. But, the first 2, it took 5 minutes to sell my first book.
Oh, okay.
Literally 5 minutes. I walked up to the guy at McFarland and said, this book that you have out on this subject is terrible. He says, well, do you think you can do better? And he says, yes. And he says, well, contact me after the convention. And I did. And he says, yeah, we'll do this book. So it was easy. And now on to Steve.
Actually, Steve, before we start on you, I'm sorry, Richard, I wanted to go back. You mentioned something called, was it Skywall?
Skywald was a publishing company that was done by, they combined their names. So remember Saul Brodsky, who used to be the production manager at Marvel, and then he took off for a while to become his own editor like Stan Lee was. And it was, the Skywald was Brodsky, S-K-Y, and then Herschel, I think it was Herschel, might be Israel Waldman. And they combined their 2 names to create a Skywald comic book company. And they were a competitor in the black and white horror field with Warren.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. They had 3 magazines. They had Psycho, they had Nightmare, and they had Scream.
Oh, okay. I think and was this back in, when was this, when was
71 to 70 to 75. And they did have good artists. Boris Vallejo did a number of early covers for them.
Yes,
Jones did as well. And then, like I mentioned, one of my covers is was a Skywald cover back in the 70s. But he also had Sebastian Bodea, and he was a fantastic artist. Most people don't know him in this country anymore because he quit doing covers, but he's a fine arts artist in Europe now.
Yeah,
So
and I believe Israel Waldman, he published back in the 60s, not exactly, IW comics that were reprint comics.
They were illegal because he didn't have copyright on any of them.
I'm sorry.
But they had new covers,
they had new covers, and that disguised the fact that they were Plastic Man, which he did not own. And and a lot of Captain Marvel. I think he did a cup of Captain Marvel when he wasn't supposed to appear anywhere at that point.
There's some oddball. There was also another magazine publisher, I cannot remember, but they would reprint a lot of the old Stanmore horror comics and things.
Myron Faust.
Yes.
Myron also did an original book, but he screwed everybody on that one. So.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, back in the 60s and the 70s, there were a lot of oddball publishers. And the thing is, you would find those magazines at grocery stores, in their magazine racks. But
Foss stuff was very close to lowest common denominator stuff.
Yes.
Really, really, really gory.
Oh.
Yeah.
And then there was also a guy named Stanley Morris who just reprinted old pre-code horror stories in black and white.
Yeah.
But Faust actually had them redrawn gorier than they were to begin with.
Yeah.
And often had them rescripted. Same story, but rescripted. But the rescripting was terrible. It was just awful stuff.
Carl Burgos did some of those stories, didn't he?
Carl did covers. He was a cover. Yes. I think he was the art director early on for it.
Something, yes.
But they were very gory covers, too.
Yep. Not the best artist either.
No, they often had really bad artists, but, So did Charlton, but Charlton rose above that once in a while. I can't honestly say I think that the Foss books ever did when he was putting those out. Although he did have some decent cover artists, they were really gory. He did hire Dick Ayers, and Chick Stone actually do work for him too.
So, I mean, like I said, there was a lot of stuff that would surprise you from week to week.
Yeah, there was different stuff coming out all the time, and from publishers, sometimes you never knew who the heck they were.
Yeah,
American Comics Group, I had no idea. They'd been around for a long time, but when I started reading comics, they were in their dying days, and so it was weird. And they'd had weird books. They had a fat kid. I remember that. Herbie.
Yeah, Herbie.
Herbie. Yeah, he was a really fat kid who wore a beanie with a propeller on his head and had lots of pimples.
Yeah.
And a lollipop.
Yeah, and he had a lollipop in his mouth all the time, and short shorts that were overalls, checkered overalls.
Yeah.
He was a very strange looking dude, and Ogden Whitney was the artist on that. I think he was the writer too. But that was a weird, strange book, and it's actually gotten a cult status these days.
Yeah, and I think it's been reprinted by PS Art Books.
Oh, yeah.
That could be, yeah. I don't know. PS does a lot of reprinting of stuff that you wouldn't see otherwise.
Yeah.
They're a British company, but they do a really nice job of reprinting stuff.
Yes, I've got one of their hardcovers, of old science fiction, pre-code science fiction stories,
I just ordered a PS book called Tales of the Tomb, which is John Stanley, who wrote Little Lulu, of all things, wrote a giant 80-page horror book back in 1962, and it was so scary that Dell had to pull it off the stands because they had so many people, because Dell didn't go with a comic code. They never did. But it really is scary. And he also wrote the first issue of Ghost Stories #1. And they are very, very scary stories. The Monster of Dread End, that's one creepy story, man. And the more you think about it, the creepier it gets. It's one of those just sneaks up on you. And Mr. Green Must Be Fed. That's another great one. It was a rug that ate you.
I'm sorry, Richard. I'm going to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Steve, I'm going to ask you, so how did you start as a writer, interviewing comic book creators and so on?
Just kind of, again, kind of like Richard, backdoor kind of deal. I was always a comic fan, growing up. I'd go to some of the early conventions down in Texas, and then we had a few here in Oklahoma City back in the early 70s called multicons, and we'd have people anywhere from Alex Toth would be here to oh gosh, I'm trying to remember just some old movie actors, George Takei and people like that would come to some of the conventions. And so I'd I've been a collector for a long time. Then I kind of bought comics for a long time, still collecting sort of, but then started going back to some of the early, Dallas conventions and stuff. And you just start meeting dealers and start seeing some of the fans there that you get to talking to and getting to know, and some of the professional artists and writers that would be and I kind of got back into it, and then I got contacted somehow. I can't remember. I'd start writing letters or wanting to send an article or two to, like I said, some of the Overstreet magazines, and it seems like just little by little, I kind of got into the writing side of it. It might be an interview here. I just would, out of the blue, just kind of get in touch, like lucky with Russ Heath or Rick Estrada, who was a wonderful person. And just, little by little, then I got connected to the Big Five collectors out in California, and Chris Pedron called me, and I gave him information while he was kind of doing his information guide. And somehow my wife and I wound up going to a convention out in San Diego back in the late 90s, and when Chris Pedron's guide came out, and got to know them, and they had a dinner that they would have every year. Like it would be at a steak place or a pizza place or something. and some of the, big five collectors would be there, but we'd have some of the pros there too. So the second one I ever went to, Russ Heath and Mort Drucker were there, and got to talk with them. And then lo and behold, three people dropped by just to say hi at that dinner, and it was Julia Schwartz, Joe Giella, and Rick Estrada.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to know them. So little by little, I'd go to San Diego, and that's how I met Sam Glansman one year.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I became friends with him probably about 20 years ago. So you get to know these people at some of the dinners at kind of a more casual setting than just sitting behind a table going, will you sign this book? So it was kind of interesting. So little by little, I kind of got into writing, and somehow Richard and I connected. I forget who it was through, but it might have been through, either Alter Ego or, one of the comic book marketplace, or,
Actually, I bought you one of your
CD
magazine things, and it had your address on it.
That's right. Yeah, okay. Like I said, the CD magazine panelography was kind of just a little, vanity project that I enjoyed doing, but it helped me develop my writing skills through doing that stuff and doing interviews. And plus just, I was very privileged to interview the people that I talked to, and, or just getting information from. Like I got to talk to Julia Schwartz, or Joe Gill, who was a, prolific writer for Charlton.
Mm-hmm.
So, little by little, I kind of went from fan to, expanding my interest in comics and writing and wanting to do more than what I had been doing. That's sort of like, again, it's kind of a back door, kind of one thing led to another.
Mm-hmm. Steve, I want to ask, I'm going to go back a little bit. Because the self-published magazine, the CD,
Yes.
I mean, was that an actual hard copy magazine?
No, it was actually done just and all the writing was converted to PDF forms and put on put on a regular CD disc.
Okay.
And it was just basically it was a computer magazine.
Okay.
So you'd get the disc and pop it in, and you could select what to read or something, and I'd have pictures on it and stuff, that I'd scanned in and things like that. So it just kind of, I was experimenting at the time, and I just kind of was presenting something other than it was too expensive to publish a magazine.
Mm-hmm.
It just wasn't cost effective. So CD was kind of, a cheap alternative. Of course, 25 years ago, I was learning about computers too. So, and the things you could do with them.
Yeah. Wow.
So I mean, I still, got a lot of stuff still in, all my files on disk. So.
Mm-hmm. This is an off the cuff question, and if you can answer it, I'm just asking is,
Right.
If a listener is interested, can they still buy one of your CDs?
Oh, I would probably have to go back. The computers have gotten a little more sophisticated. Maybe would be a good way to put it. I could probably put something together, but I have a few leftovers. I could, I'd have to go back and look. I can email those, what I have to you. Okay.
Yeah. No, I'm just.
I could just. Or I'll tell you what. I'll get your mail, and you can email me your address, and I'll just send a few to you. Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Sure.
One of his CD magazines was the pretend painted DC covers, where they did tried to make their covers look like they were painted. They weren't, but they were gray toned.
Mm-hmm.
They were colored, but they had gray tones underneath. So it often gave them the look of being not pen and inked like they were.
Yeah.
And that was the first time I'd seen a collection of those. I'd seen the covers from time to time, but that was the first time I ever saw a collection of those. And I thought, well, this is really cool.
Yeah.
I mean, it was cool to have that available, and I still have it. I still have it set in an easy to access place in case I ever want to look up one of them.
Mhm.
Because
I mean,
you never know what you're going to need. That's the God's honest truth when you're doing it.
I mean, I look around at all my references that I have, and I should be better organized. I know everyone always has a pile of something. They know what's in that pile, but it looks disorganized. But it's not.
No, I mean, Steve, I understand. I'm like, I'm disorganized, but it's like, it's organized mess. I know where things are.
Exactly.
Yeah. So okay. So you guys started to go. How did you guys meet? Because I know Richard, you started to talk about how you bought one of correct me if I'm wrong. You bought one of Steve's CDs. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So how did you? Mhm.
We didn't actually meet until we'd been collaborating for probably about 4 years.
Yeah, lots of emails and
We did lots of
back
emails.
and forth.
But that's the only time we've ever physically met so far.
Yeah, that was it. San Diego in 2017.
2017 or 2016, one of the two.
I think it's 17.
Sounds right.
I looked
That
on my
sounds right.
phone and I got a picture of you and me together. And
Okay, if it's dated, I'll go by that. So
okay.
But that was the first time we actually met, and we discovered we had a lot in common, and I like the guy.
Yep.
Sometimes that doesn't happen when you meet him in person.
Yes.
You can have a great online relationship, and then you meet him in person, and you realize, oh, this guy is maybe not going to be a good friend. Because sometimes there's a mile and a half of difference between the two. Yeah. Steve was like I was meeting somebody that I'd been known for years.
Yep, exactly. I mean,
and we had many of the same interests.
That's good.
He had the same interest in new stuff that I did. It was fun, but I actually contacted him. I'd finished the first 2 books that I published. And I was thinking about this really, really long project that I knew was going to be long, and I didn't have enough information for it. And I said, well, who do I know who might be a good source? And I thought, he's not only a good source, he'd probably be a good person to team up with on this. And it was supposed to be originally an entire history of American war comics.
Right.
And that is a huge and much more complicated book than you think it's going to be when you start out. I thought, well, we could bat this out in a year or 2.
Yeah.
We found out that's not quite
an enormous amount of reading you've got to do. And all kinds of weird little pathways that lead off from what you're initially thinking is pretty straightforward war comics. Hey,
yeah.
But, it doesn't work that way.
Yes.
Yeah.
So and the book that we have now was originally supposed to be a part of that book.
Oh.
And we sent the initial proposal to Fantagraphics. And Mike Ketron was the guy we were in contact with. And he was enthusiastic.
Yes.
But, at Fantagraphics, there's a committee, I guess, you got to go through.
Oh, okay.
And we didn't make it through the committee. It took him a long time to make that decision because it was a committee. But it took a long. But he suggested, you really have 2 books here. And maybe you should split the real big 5 off from that and do the history and then do the real big 5. And it was a great suggestion. Give him all the credit. He's credited in the book for being helpful and all that sort of thing. One of the people we couldn't have done the book without. But it actually made sense to do that.
Yeah. And
so
he pointed us in the right direction. That's for sure.
Well, okay. All right. So. And then correct me if I'm wrong. So this is where it leads to our Artists at War, the best of the best American war comics book that's coming out soon. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes. That's our first book. We hope to have the other book that, is the history of American war comics. Some of what was in that originally is now in this big, this our Artist at War book. But there's so much more material that that we did not include in this book, and we're going to have to rewrite some stuff. But it's a history lesson. We know that, and
Well, we
it
didn't
seems to be
actually,
ongoing.
but in terms of rewriting, we didn't actually finish this book until a very intensive 5 or 6 week period in April and May. I mean, I don't know about Steve, but I was doing 13, 14-hour days with my regular job and working on this. Wow. It was a long couple 6 weeks, but it was worth it in the end, I think. I mean, it improved the book a lot. We put in at least one full extra chapter. We revised every single word in that book, I think, at one point or another.
Yeah, we
did all the captions. And there's 204 pieces of artwork, I think, maybe more than that now. It might have increased a little bit right there at the end.
Yeah, Richard sent me some of them, and I'm the one that kind of assembled them all.
Yep. He did, like I said, he did most of the scans for the artwork, and I did most of the writing for it, but he worked on the writing too, correcting stuff I didn't have exactly right, and vice versa. I mean, it's very much a collaboration.
Oh, yes.
There are pages where I know I wrote this. There are pages I know he wrote this, and there are pages where I can't tell, and that's a sign of a good collaboration.
Yeah, we kind of, overlapped quite a bit, in some of those chapters here and there.
Sometimes we had to cut down stuff.
Yes.
Because it was just too much. And there are some times when we had to increase stuff because we didn't have enough. That entire Jack Kirby chapter in the book was done in that 6 weeks in April and May of this year. And it was really under pressure because we had to get it done. Because John wanted it. He not only said, yes, I want to do it, I want to have it ready for my summer catalog.
Oh,
We got to get this stuff done.
I mean, we've taken quite a few years to work on the book, but John kind of woke us up, so to speak, and we kind of really got into, more than second gear, third gear, maybe. But it really, he really motivated us to kind of get everything coalesced and refined and rewritten, and make sure our thoughts are coherent.
We ended up selecting a lot of new artwork that we probably would not have considered if you had said, legally we could only do so many EC scans. He said, oh, well, we got to start kicking stuff out because we had a lot of EC artwork we wanted. And we still ran a good section, but there were certain things we couldn't do. And then we were looking at, we got going out, and we realized this is going to be a trade paperback, and maybe it can support 2 pieces of artwork per page, and that makes a big difference in what you put on that page. So,
and then John came up
increased some stuff quite a lot.
Yeah, and John added some artwork that he had. So some of the Jack Kirby stuff, and like I said, it's not me or Richard doing 100% of the art pieces. We were lucky that we probably did 90%. Some of the things that you'll see in the book, come from John Morrow. We can't, we appreciate him a lot for what he added.
We actually sent in the finished pages from the book, and then he substituted the pencil drawings because that's pure Jack Kirby. And he had the original pencil art. I thought, well, yeah, that's a smart thing to do. Some of it's still in color, but those black and white pencil things, if you're going to do Jack Kirby and you want him to be in pure as raw as you want him to, as you would like to see him sometimes, this is how you do it. You look at the original pencils. So I'm very happy with that chapter. I think it's worked out just.
And, and we don't want to say also the book is, a past history book. We have, that chapter with, about Wayne Van Zant and Don Lomax and Garth Ennis. And, they're very vibrant people that are producing some of the best war comics, graphic novels, and stories, in today's times. So
I would even go beyond some of the best and say simply the best right at the moment.
It's,
they are the current masters of the field. Just like Russ Heath was back in the day and Joe Kubert were. That's how important they are to the war comics right now.
When
there are other artists who are good, those 3, in my opinion, are the best 3 working right
Yeah. They know how to tell a story.
Yes.
You know, you really get involved in the story, you know, not just looking at pretty pictures and reading some of the words on the, you know, on each page. Like I said, the Wayne Van Zant's Katusha is just so engrossing that once you start it, you know, you just can't put it down. And Don Lomax's Vietnam, you know, stuff is just really gets you there.
Yeah.
And Garth Ennis, he does, I was going to say from historical periods, but they're, you know, it's such fine work, and the characters are just rich.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Battlefields. Yes.
Dynamite. Yes.
And Battlefields is only a short, I mean, everybody thinks, oh, Preacher or The Boys or something like that. But he's written an astonishing number of war comics in the last 15, 20 years.
Oh, yes. And the thing is,
Battlefields, Battle Stories. That one you're holding in your hand. That was the last one I read before we published.
Wow.
And no, the one you're holding in your hand, the one about the women Russian snipers.
Sarah from TK.
Oh, yes.
That is a great book, man.
Yes,
that is fantastic.
You know.
Or
the fact that they often have a basis in truth, I like that.
Yeah,
I noticed that after he published his Night Witches, suddenly there were a whole lot of not comic books, regular prose books being written about the Night Witches. And I thought somebody read his Night Witches, says, well, that would be a good book for here.
Yeah.
And mentioned it to a writer, and they did it. But I think that's influential. That's what it should be.
Yeah. His Dreaming Eagles, about some of the black World War II
Tuskegee
pilots.
Airmen.
Yes, that's, you know, phenomenal, you know, to read that. And, you know, especially during, you know, with Black history being really coming to the forefront now.
Yes.
Just stuff like that. But the Russian involvement in World War II is covering. Also some of the his book, The String Bags, you know, and some of those that are coming out through Aftershock are just, you know.
Many of that is not familiar to American readers. And I think that's a good thing to have, is that it brings a fresh flavor into what you're doing.
Yes.
But it's still a war comic.
Yeah.
And I think that all of that leads into basically what we started the book in the first place. We were mentioning the influence of these three guys today. That didn't come from nowhere. That came from Harvey Kurtzman, literally creating the war comic genre in 1950. It wasn't there before. There were war comics before that. But the war comic genre, as we know it today, did not exist in the 1940s. It was just separate comics.
Yeah.
He created it, and it blew up overnight. Marvel at one time had 27 monthly war comics coming out in 52, 53, 54. 27. And EC only had 2. And it was still better than all 27 of Marvel's. Not because Marvel was bad, but because they had Harvey Kurtzman writing.
Oh, okay.
I mean, and then there's Charlton, you know.
Yes.
Charlton really, when a lot of comic companies, were failing.
Yes.
Charlton would acquire their inventories, you know, like from Stanmore or
Fawcett. They took a lot from that.
Fawcett. And they would kind of, or St. John, you know, where Fighting Marines came from. They acquired like the old material or the issues that hadn't seen print yet. They kind of finished up the printing and then continued some of the titles.
They picked up Foxhole from Jack Kirby.
Yes. And I mean, you know, some people put down Charlton, but if you'll kind of really go through, Sam Glanzman did some phenomenal art. And then Willie Franz, when they collaborated on the war. Willie Schultz.
Yes.
And the Iron Corporal.
That kind of was sneaking under the radar, you know, but it was as good reading as any DC or Marvel war comic.
Okay.
One of the things I'd like to say is that of the creators that we cover in this book,
Yes.
with the exception of maybe Garth Ennis, who I do not know for sure,
Mhm.
and Willie Franz, who was 4F and could not join the military, everybody that we're talking about was a serviceman at one time.
Yes.
Mhm.
Kirby, Tanager, Kubert, Kurtzman,
Mhm.
Glansman,
Mhm. Yes.
Van Zandt,
Mhm.
Don Lomax, they were all veterans of
Yes.
the military.
Mhm.
They may not have fought in a war
Mhm.
because it depends on what time their service was. Archie Goodwin, all part of the military at one time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that was helpful in how they approached these stories.
Yes.
Some of the early issues of Foxhole were actually touted as being created by, veterans.
Mhm.
Yeah, they all had their military ranks when
Mhm.
their names were presented on the page. It was, PFC this and Corporal Jack Kirby, and I don't know if it was Corporal, but you get the drill.
Yeah.
It was that, they had their ranks. They were not just identified by name. Their ranks were put on it. So I thought that was a nice touch.
That is nice.
I mean, there's such a richness of the 50s and 60s war comics that, and Richard and I will both admit we're fans of everybody that we have, written about in this book. We can look at Harvey Kurtzman or Joe Kubert or Don Lomax, and,
Yes.
they all interconnect. There's a common thread there of wanting to tell a story about the common man who has to go and fight a war.
Yeah.
And that's what it all, gets down to. It's not
And an
about,
attempt on every one of their parts to tell it as truthfully as they can under the restrictions they may be working under.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm.
I know some people put down
Kurtzman
go ahead.
was right up in front by saying, I did not want to write stories for children that glorified war.
Yeah. Yes.
Because he thought that was dishonest.
Mhm.
War is not, kids shouldn't go around going rat-a-tat-tat thinking that they're going to live through this battle because they're Americans.
Yes.
Americans died in wars.
Mhm.
And sometimes it wasn't a pleasant death, and sometimes what they saw wasn't pleasant, and he deliberately wrote stories to reflect that. They were accurate military-wise. I mean, he was also the guy who started, if we're going to put a gun in this story, it's going to be a gun that could have been used at that time.
Yes.
It was a cannon that could be used. It was a plane that looked accurate.
Mhm.
He sent Jerry DeFuco, who became an editor at Mad Magazine. He was his assistant. He sent him out to tour a submarine so they could take pictures of the sub while he was down in there so that they could use those for how sub looked like underwater.
Yeah, Kurtzman was a stickler for accuracy.
Mhm. And then before you guys continue on, I'm going to mention to our listeners, because I'm going to be honest, I didn't know about Harvey Kurtzman, and him writing war comics.
Mhm.
The two comics that you guys mentioned in the book is, he did Two-Fisted Tales and Frontline Combat.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you've
Those
never
two
read
comics
those,
set
you
the-
need to.
Those two comics set the template for every war comic that came after them, every single one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody gets away with writing a war comic without
Yeah.
having some idea, or at least having seen somebody draw their influence from the EC books.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the God's honest truth. You can get by without following Black Hawk, but you can't get by doing war comics if you don't have some inkling of what Two-Fisted Tales and Frontline Combat were.
Yeah, they set the standards, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But not to say that there weren't good writers elsewhere. There were,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah. Hank Chapman was a very good writer for Marvel.
yes, and Robert Kanigher,
Oh, yes.
he knew what he was writing about.
Yes.
And Joe Gill wrote good stories for Charlton.
Yes.
So those were the three main writers for war comics for all three companies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't recall Stan Lee writing a war comic until Sergeant Fury #1, but he may have.
Mhm.
But I don't recall him ever writing any war. He usually identified himself because he was the editor.
Mm-hmm.
There was always a Stan Lee, very stylized, looked like Bill Everett had designed the word, his name. But there was always a Stan Lee. If he wrote it, he actually put his name on there somewhere.
Oh yes, because I have the, and I know our listeners can't see it, but but I have the Epic Collection, the Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commandos.
Mm-hmm.
Stan Lee, yeah. So,
Yeah, I have that too.
And I think another thing that war comics don't get credit for is that they were the first comics after the Comics Code shut down all mention of prejudice.
oh,
They were the comics that reintroduced prejudice back in as a going concern. It was first in Sergeant Rock and then in Sergeant Fury. Both of them, and we try to detail both of those. Particularly the Kirby, the Stan Lee Jack Kirby, which is in that Epic book you were just holding up. It's issue number 7. But they had problems with that book too. The black guy is colored white in the first issue. I don't know if he still is being colored white, but he was colored white in the original book.
Yes.
Because the printer did not believe that they meant to have a black soldier in that comic, because black soldiers and whites were segregated at the time.
Yes.
So in that first issue, he was colored white all the way through. And then for another 30 or 40 issues, he was never colored black. He was colored gray.
Because I just saw that in issue, I'm flipping through the pages, I just saw that, yeah.
He was colored gray, except on the cover. He was black on the cover, but he was gray on the interiors up until like issue 46, 47.
That's, yeah.
A long time.
Racism hadn't really been touched upon since the EC days, really. I mean, Kurtzman did, he touched on, black soldiers and Japanese American soldiers too, back then. And even some of the issues of GI Combat, when they were published by Quality, had a black sergeant in a couple of the stories. So you'd find things like that, but EC probably set the standard for, trying to expose, inequality.
Yes.
Well, EC went so far as they actually had the Klan. They didn't call them the Klan, but they were in Klan uniforms.
Yeah.
Terrorizing people in crime stories.
Oh, okay.
They had, they got in trouble. Their last story that they published in the last color comic, they almost got canned. It was a reprint because they'd already canned the story that was supposed to go there. The Comics Code had said total no to the first story. So they brought in a reprint, which is about this spaceman who lands on this planet, and he's having to deal with these robots, which are prejudiced against each other because their skin, their shield, their armor, whatever you want to call it, their steel skin is colored differently from each one. One of them, or some of them are yellow, some of them are blue, so they're having difficulty integrating themselves. So he finds a way to do it. And then at the very last panel, he takes his helmet off because he can't breathe on the planet that he's on. He's wearing a spacesuit. He takes his helmet off, and he's a black guy. And he's sweating because he's really sweating because he had a helmet on the whole time of the story. And they tried to cancel that one too, because the black guy is sweating.
Yeah.
Now, that's not the reason they wanted to get rid of that story.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a stupid reason to get rid of a story.
Yes.
It was because he was a black guy at the end of that story.
It's silly. It seems silly now, but
it seems silly now. But it was that was the last story that EC printed, and the last story that dealt with any kind of racial prejudice until Jackie Johnson showed up in that Sergeant Rock story.
Yes. What color? What's the color of your blood?
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Because
so it was in war comics, oddly enough, because those units were strictly segregated during World War II. Jackie Johnson could not have been in Easy Company, and Gabe Jones could not have been in the Howling Commandos.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but they did it anyway just to prove a point.
Yeah.
And good for them.
Yes.
Because that gave rise for Kirby and Lee to do the Black Panther 3 years later, I guess.
Oh, yeah.
And that changed everything.
But yeah.
that's a whole nother topic to go, get into,
Yeah, but it's an important one because
that it is important. Yes.
A lot of breakthroughs in how comics presented themselves. Sam Gladsman did the first gay story in comic book history.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
It's a story called Toro.
Mhm.
And he doesn't mention the word homosexual in the story whatsoever. But anybody, and I don't know, how old were you, Steve, when you read that?
Oh,
I was probably 14, 15.
Yeah, I'm a little older than you, so I was, I was in my 20s.
It didn't take me any real difficulty to figure out they were talking about gay people.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But it's not mentioned. It's not, he's not humiliated like you would think he might be.
Yeah.
And the story doesn't hit you in the face or try to,
No.
preach to you.
Mhm.
It just evolves in a natural way.
It's
It's at the end. The ending is tragic, but it's not tragic because he's gay.
Mhm.
It's tragic because he doesn't live.
Mhm.
So I think that's an important thing. He's not treated any differently in any major respect as any of the other sailors or Marines he's working with.
Oh.
And I want to touch on Sam Glansman.
Yes.
With the USS Stevens was kind of a rarity in that it was, he was the writer artist. He did, and he had total control of the 4 and 5 page stories. And some of the subjects he would touch on, some would be humorous, some would be, just, tragic, like the way war should be.
Yes.
It's not glorified.
Mhm.
But he could touch on things like, Color Me Brave. And that was a story someone had written and said, how come you don't have any black sailors? So that was a story in reaction to that, about a black sailor.
Mhm.
And just, things like Sam was, I was lucky to get to know him, and Richard kind of knows him too, or knew him too. And we both know his wife, Sue.
Mhm.
And Sam just, that was a thing that he did. Thank goodness that DC Comics allowed him to do,
And I think you should emphasize the fact that Joe Kubert was his editor for all of those that were published. And that's probably why he had so much carte blanche to do what he wanted to, because Joe had absolute trust in him.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So he could write about anything.
Mhm.
And there's an amazing number of really stories that really hit hard from those little 4 and 5 pagers that were just considered filler. But like I mentioned in the book, a lot of people, including myself, would buy DC War Comics if they opened it up and in the back was one of those little 4 or 5 pagers. That made it worth buying right there.
Oh yeah.
Because you knew even if the front story wasn't so hot, and that's not true in most cases with the DC comic at that time.
Yeah.
But even if it wasn't that great,
Mhm.
that story would be.
Mhm.
And you'd be thinking about that story for a long time.
Oh yeah. Mhm.
So,
I don't know if you've seen the 2 collections that Dover, published. One is the USS Stevens. The other is the collection of the 2 graphic novels that Marvel, published, a sailor story.
That's an autobiography by Sam.
Yeah. And if you haven't seen those, we both highly recommend those 2 collections.
Okay. Yes.
Not only highly recommend them to you, but to any reader or listener to this podcast, because they're that good.
Yes.
When was the last time you saw a comic book collection with the endorsement of George Bush and Barack Obama in the front pages? So. I've never seen that happen. And they both wrote in letters for this publication. So, and there's a complete history in the back by John Cook about the stuff, about the stories themselves and how they evolved. It's an excellent and it's like a brick. I mean, it's a big book.
I mean, Sam lived that life. I mean, he was one of the few people that, that wrote about his experiences on board a ship in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he kind of gave us a connection from, now to back then, and personal stuff. So,
and we mentioned the fact that he treated homosexuals and he treated black people, but he also treated the Japanese fairly.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
yeah.
he handled the Chinese a few times where their stories where Chinese were involved in it. He treated them fairly. There were no buck-toothed little grinning guys with glasses.
Yeah.
They were people.
Yeah.
It wasn't stereotypes.
A guy flying a kamikaze plane, he's thinking what somebody flying a kamikaze plane might think.
Mm-hmm.
There was an ironic one where a guy's escorting his kamikaze buddies for their first mission. He trained them, and he knows they're going to die.
Yeah.
And he's going to fly back and train the next bunch.
Mm-hmm.
But he gets R&R, and he ends up in his hometown,
Mm-hmm.
which is unfortunately Hiroshima,
Yeah.
the day it's bombed.
Oh, my
So he
goodness.
doesn't make it through the war either. But that's a rare case of Sam using an O. Henry twist, but it's an effective O. Henry twist.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, some of the early war comics probably were more stereotypical, you know, the evil enemy and all that.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, the comics later on, I'm not saying warmed up to it, but they tried to present other viewpoints and
Yes.
made the characters more human. And
Yes.
that's what's nice about today's writers, Van Zant, you know, Ennis and Lomax, is that they really, you know, they're character-driven stories.
Yes.
And, you know, the stories revolve around the people, not just situations. So, you know.
And we haven't mentioned Archie Goodwin yet, but Goodwin,
Oh, yes. Blazing Combat.
Blazing Combat, to me, is the best single comic book ever printed in the war comic genre.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
I mean, every story is top-notch.
Mm-hmm.
Goodwin wrote all of them except for one,
Mm-hmm.
and another one he co-wrote with Alex Toth, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
But Wally Wood wrote one, and all the rest of them are by Archie Goodwin, and it shows because Goodwin was a writer that you followed.
Mm-hmm.
It
Yeah.
didn't matter what he was writing. His Iron Man stories were better than most other people's Iron Man stories.
Yes.
Even though I don't really like Iron Man as a
Mm-hmm.
character. But he wrote interesting stories. His Hulk were fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
His stuff for Creepy and Eerie were what made Creepy and Eerie what Creepy and Eerie were.
Yeah.
So, and not only that, he was an editor that if you've ever listened to people, writers talk about their editors, not always so complimentary.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody, and I mean no one, not even the nastiest person you can think of, will say a bad word about Archie Goodwin. He was that good and that kind.
Yeah, and artists liked him, like Russ Heath, because he would write what they would visualize themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So he really wrote to the artist, you know, trying to get into their head and how he wanted them to present, you know, a panel or a page or whatever. And the artist, you know, like Russ Heath would say, yeah, he wrote it the way I wanted to see it.
Yes.
So
He told me the same
that's the kind
story.
of person Goodwin was.
Heath told me pretty much the same story. He said that he did little pencil drawings of the page.
Oh, okay.
And he says, I'm not going to pay any attention to this because this guy's a writer. He's not an artist. He didn't know that Archie was not he was a cartoonist. He was not a fine artist like Heath. He said, I'm not going to pay any attention to this. I'm going to draw it the way I want to, and then I'll look at it and see how much I improved on it.
Mm-hmm.
He says, except for one panel, Goodwin's layouts match Russ's layouts to the T.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, that's how I knew that I would like working with Archie Goodwin anytime he came up with a story for me.
Yeah.
And that was not the only time that happened.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well, is there anything we haven't covered yet? Or you're getting ready to ask something?
Sorry. Yeah. So, okay. So when you guys talk about Archie Goodwin, Blazing Combats, now, because again, that's a blind spot for me. What company was Blazing Combat published?
Warren.
Oh, okay.
That was when they started out, they wanted to emulate EC, and EC started out doing horror,
Mm-hmm.
and then they did war,
Mm-hmm.
and then they did crime. They went back to crime,
Mm-hmm.
and they did science fiction.
Yes.
Well, no one in 1964 wanted to do science fiction, so that was out by automatically.
Mm-hmm.
Science fiction was considered the graveyard if you spent money on it and you just went into the tanker on it,
Mm.
which is not the way it is today at all.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But yeah. And Goodwin also had the best of the best working for him, just like EC had the best of the best artists. Many of them
All the same artist.
Same artist in many cases.
Yeah.
But Frazzetti did the covers. Frazzetti did all 4 Blazing Combat covers.
Mm-hmm.
They had Gene Colan. They had Angelo Torres. They had Gray Morrow. They had Wally Wood. They had Alex Toth.
John Severin.
They had Russ Heath.
Joe Orlando.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Jerry Graninetti did also ghosted for Joe Orlando for a lot of those stories too.
Yes.
Ghosted the penciling, not the ink.
Yes. No. Yeah. I just want to ask this question. I mean, we already touched about, let me ask you this, guys. Let me ask you guys this question. What other trends did you guys notice while writing this book? And let me explain a little bit more. Like, for me, it's like, I don't remember seeing any stories about the Korean conflict. I remember seeing very little Vietnam stories in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And I know in the late 80s, they started to do Vietnam War comics, like, what was it? Don Lomax,
Vietnam Journal.
Yeah. And then,
well, there were reasons for all of those.
Mm-hmm.
In the 50s, the Korean conflict was very much interpreted.
Mm-hmm.
But it was largely dropped because I think they realized that fans were forgetting about the Korean conflict and they remembered World War II.
Okay.
As for Vietnam, they started out, DC and Marvel both did some Vietnam stories, but the anti-war movement was so strong and they had such jingoistic storylines. DC in particular, their Vietnam stories had no relationship to what was actually going on in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Zero. They were essentially World War II stories set in Vietnam.
Yeah.
They had nothing to do with what was actually going on. And fans were complaining about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so they pulled all Vietnam stories out of DC Comics.
Mm-hmm.
And Marvel didn't do very many to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
Charlton kept going for quite a while. One of those was illustrated by Sam Gladsman. What was it? Shotgun Harker and the Chicken?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Something like that. It was actually a pretty good strip written by Joe Gill, who was a real conservative.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But that was Charlton, and Charlton didn't abide by much of the rules because the editors really didn't look at them that much.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly the owners I don't think the owners ever read a single comic they ever put out. I don't think they ever did.
Mm-hmm.
And the editor had so many books, I can't believe he read them all either. That would be such a tremendous reading job each month. Because they were publishing 45, 46, 47 comics a month.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a small thing to read.
Yeah.
That's a lot of comics.
Yeah.
And especially if you're reading them with the idea of correcting stuff. That doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
I guess we'll mention Willie Franz at this point, if you want to.
Yes.
He kind of actually was a lot younger than Sam. He was a kid when he kind of wrote to him and got in touch with him, and they connected to, do the Willie Schultz stories. And Charlton, like Richard said, they weren't paying a lot of attention to what they were publishing.
Mm-hmm.
So he was able to sneak some themes in that they didn't notice for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct, Richard?
That is correct. Actually, Willie was 15 when he started writing professionally for Charlton.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
He was working with Sam almost exclusively to begin with. But he impressed the heck out of him because he wrote a story about D-Day that was 27 pages long.
Wow.
And they published it. Now, Charlton only did anthology war stories at that point, and very rarely were they over 9 pages.
Mm-hmm.
10 pages maybe. But 27 pages was full book size.
Mm-hmm.
And they paid him a bonus. They liked that story so much. And have Cheapwad Charlton pay you a bonus means they really, really liked that story. And it wasn't told from the American viewpoint. It was told from the viewpoint of a lieutenant in a pillbox, a German lieutenant in a pillbox, looking out to sea one morning and seeing the D-Day invasion come at him.
Mm-hmm.
And that was all just the first day, and what he did on that very first day as a German lieutenant.
Mm-hmm.
And it was unusual. And for a 15-year-old to come up with that, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm just gonna ask for our listeners. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. So Willie Schultz, that was one of the war comic book series. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then can you just give a little description about this comic book series?
You want to do that, Steve, or you want me to?
I'll let you do this one, okay?
Willie Schultz was an American soldier,
mm-hmm.
German ancestry, could speak fluent German,
mm-hmm.
who was accused of treason by a jealous subordinate. He was accused of deliberately murdering a general's son during battle. And he escaped. He was sentenced to death, and he escaped his death when his convoy that he was being conveyed in was attacked. And this is in North Africa. And he ran across the desert. And of course, it's the Sahara Desert.
Yeah.
You're not going to run very far.
Yeah.
And he couldn't go back to the Americans, so he went to the Germans. He found a dead German, and he put his uniform on, and he went over and found himself working for the Germans for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it doesn't say he actually killed any Americans. He actually stopped one potential battle by blowing up the ammo dump in a German supply camp.
Mm-hmm.
But he does switch back and forth in uniform numerous times during his career thereafter.
Mm-hmm.
And his career was taking him obviously towards the end of the war. And what would he do when the war ended? I mean, he couldn't go back to the States. He couldn't go back to his parents. He'd been declared a traitor and a murderer.
Mm-hmm.
But what was he going to do in Germany? Because he was also killing Germans all the time he was there too. So that was the conundrum of the character. And it ended early because sometime in late 1969 or early 1970, after he'd been running for about 2, maybe 3 years at that point, someone influential in New York State declared himself a conscientious objector because of that comic book. The Army, his parents, I guess, complained to the Army, what the hell kind of comic book are you publishing that would make my son become a conscientious objector?
Mm-hmm.
And they called up Charlton and said, what the hell kind of a comic are you publishing here? And Charlton had, of course, no idea what the hell they were publishing because they never read the damn things.
Mm-hmm.
So they looked at it and says, oops, and canceled all of his strips and blackballed him. Blackballed Willie. They didn't blackball Sam. They needed Sam.
Yeah.
Willie was a teenager. So they blackballed. They fired him and blackballed him, and he didn't get any comic book work for another 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, they just pulled.
That's the story of both Willie Schultz and the Iron Corporal in a way.
Yeah. He had those 2 series going, and he had a couple of standalone stories too.
He had a number of standalone stories that were really good too. Not just the D-Day one, but there were 72 Tons of Steel was a true story, and I liked that one a lot. Sam didn't illustrate that one, but it was really well done.
Or the Huertgen Forest one, that was a good one.
Yep, that was a good one too.
Yes.
And there was one he did about the Marines, but I can't remember the name of it. The Korean fella, Sanyo Kim, drew it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a good story.
Yeah. Like I said, Charlton would, they had a lot of mediocre stuff, but, there were some things that kind of really were outstanding, but you had to look for them.
The thing that most distinguishes all of the characters that we're talking about, even Jack Kirby, is that their stories were, for their time, and often still are today, subversive.
Mm-hmm.
They were not doing the normal thing. Even Kanigher and Kubert's work on Enemy Ace.
Yes.
You've got a character who's not an American. He's a German pilot. They made sure that they never referred to him shooting down American planes. They always shot down French or Belgian or British, Canadian sometimes. But he didn't shoot down Americans because they didn't actually explain why he didn't shoot down Americans. They said he did. But here's a guy who's basically an Edgar Allan Poe character. He's melancholy to the nth degree. He's not the typical Teutonic strutting around with a scar. He has the scar.
Yes.
He's not strutting around. He's not wearing the monocle.
Mm-hmm.
He's not big and brawny. He's thin.
Mm-hmm.
He looks a lot like Bernie Wrightson looked, although Bernie Wrightson wasn't that age, so it wasn't modeled on him, but he looked a lot like Bernie Wrightson.
Mm-hmm.
And Bernie Wrightson looked like, when in his early days, when he was young, he looked like a Poe character.
Yeah.
So here was this guy, and he was tired of fighting.
Yes.
He was called names by everybody who met him. He
Mm-hmm.
had no friends that you could ever see,
Mm-hmm.
except this strange wolf that wandered in the woods. Wherever he landed his plane, that wolf would show up,
That's right.
which was weird. And it took Garth Ennis to explain what the hell that wolf was all about,
Mm-hmm.
years and years later.
Yeah.
But that was subversive. That guy was so melancholy that he made the Silver Surfer, who was the most melancholy character in comics,
Mm-hmm.
look like a normal dude.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Enemy Ace, or Hans von Hammer. He wasn't morally conflicted, but he tried to be a moral person in a war situation.
Yeah.
And it was, probably searching, soul searching was a lot going on with the character.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's tough to be a moral person during wartime.
Yes.
And I
Or
think
being called the enemy,
I think that's the one we had the most difficulty with when we were writing a chapter, because as I mentioned in the book, if you read one Hans von Hammer story,
Mm-hmm.
it's fantastic.
Yeah.
If you read all of them, there's a lot of repetition.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because it was written to be read once a month
Mm-hmm.
by young kids who maybe had read the previous issue and maybe had not. Whereas we had to reread every single story that we talk about in here. We read all of EC. We read all of Blazing Combat. We read all of Enemy Ace from 1965 till late 70s.
Uh-huh.
No, longer than that, because we read the graphic novels too.
Yeah.
We read all of the Iron Corporal. We read we read all of Willie Franz's stories, period. At least I did. I'm pretty sure that Steve did as well.
Yeah.
We read all of the USS Stevens stuff. We read all of Jack Kirby stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Read all of Don Lomax, all of Garth Ennis, all of Wayne Van Sant. That's a lot of reading.
Yes.
There's a surprising amount of work there. You're talking about thousands of pages.
Yeah.
And we had to read them all because you can't really talk about them. One of the things that struck me when I was first described as a comic historian is it scared me.
Mm-hmm.
I says, wait, if I'm considered a comic historian, that means I've got to be right all the time.
Yeah.
I can't be right once in a while. I got to be right all the time, or explain why I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a scary prospect. On the other hand, you can use it to your advantage. So.
Well, I'm sure we're going to have, our critics of this book, and I'm sure we've made a mistake or two here and there, but we've tried to be as accurate as possible.
Yes.
As factual as possible. We think we've covered these subjects more than anybody ever has.
Yes.
And, that'll show when you see it, but, it's been a labor of love too. I mean, the thing we both agree on wholeheartedly is we love these comics, and we love what we've read and the creators, and, they've influenced us, as, to this day. They're still influencing us. And even the old stuff, we can go back and look at it and discover something we didn't see the first time we went through it.
Yeah.
So,
And when I say we had to reread everything, don't get me wrong, that was fun.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
That was, I love this story and I still love it today.
Yeah.
What a great story this is. This is even better than I remember.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of my first, and I tell about it in the book, is one of my first memories is reading the Sam Gladsman Willie Schultz story, where Willie is fighting a German soldier for a piece of moldy bread because they're both starving.
Mm-hmm.
And I says, that scared me more than any horror story I ever read. That upset me more.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, this is really good stuff.
Yeah.
And even though I didn't know who Sam Glasman really was at that time, from then on, anytime I saw Sam Glasman, and that was before USS Stevens,
Mm-hmm.
that was what caused me to keep looking him up, because
Mm-hmm.
you don't get that good without. And it was Willie Franz too, don't get me wrong, but Willie, of course, was frozen out for a number of years, so you didn't see new stories.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And we do want to mention Sam Glasman. I mean, he did his USS Stevens stuff, but he was also one of the longest, had the longest run just about on the Haunted Tank for DC Comics. You know, it wasn't, you know, plus some horror stories here and there too. So, but, you know, the USS Stevens is probably his premier work. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it says more about him than anything. And same, you know, like for the Joe Kubert, Robert Kanigher,
Yes.
Enemy Ace, that was, you know, some of their best work they ever, you know, besides Sergeant Rock.
Oh, yeah.
But, you know, the other character is, you know, defines them just almost as much. So, and Willie Schultz and, you know, that
Mm-hmm.
Franz and Glasman did, that
Mm-hmm.
defines them. I mean, each of these creators, you can go back and pull out some of their work and just go, this is outstanding stuff.
Yes.
You know, this is great to read.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not just a story to entertain,
Yeah.
but there's an underlying element to it, or a moral, or something could be hit you in the face, or it's just very subtle, you know. Some things that are being said there are read into it, or visualized. That was the nice thing about us being all comic lovers, is we not only can read the words, we can see what we're reading.
Yes.
So it really, you know, we get to do both. We get to combine word and pictures together. So,
Steve, I'm going to ask you to clarify something for me. And like I said, I'm just asking for clarification, because I've
Okay.
read The Haunted Tank. You know, that's one of my favorite series. Correct me if I'm wrong. You said Sam Glasman wrote The Haunted Tank?
No, he did the art. Yeah.
Oh, he did.
Oh, yeah.
He did the art from 1972 until it ended in 1987.
Yeah, he
My
had a very
God.
long run.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, when Russ Heath quit doing it, and any other artist, but Glasman took over and yeah, you know, ran the series. You know, he did the art for the whole, you know, the rest of the series.
Oh my God. Because before we started the interview, I was telling Richard, you know, Sam Glasman is a blind side for me, especially the USS Stevenson. But I didn't put the two together. I didn't realize Sam drew Haunted Tank.
Yeah.
Oh my.
We both, you know, Rich and I both agree that Glasman is an underappreciated, you know, artist, you know,
Yeah.
comic artist. He's as good as any, you know, Kuberts or Heaths or Severns or
Yes.
Jack Davises or any of those people. You know, he's to us, he ranks up there, you know, with the rest of them. But
Mhm.
But he's also a great writer.
yes,
And I think that's the only reason he didn't get the I can't think of the name.
recognition maybe.
But he was supposed to get the prize for underrated writer.
Yeah,
And he couldn't. And the only way you can get it is if you attend the Comic Con.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And he didn't get it because he was too ill to make the trip. He was supposed to go, but he was too ill.
Mhm.
yeah,
And so he didn't get the recognition when he needed it right there towards the end, just before USS Stevens came out,
Mhm.
the collection.
Yeah.
So it would have been a big, I think, help
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
him.
he
But-
did do some stories for the Joe Kubert Presents, those issues that you know, some were kind of rewritten Stevens stories, and some was new material also, but that was collected, you know, along with the other, you know, contents of the Joe Kubert Presents. But there were only 6 issues, and that's a good collection also.
But those stories are also in the USS Stephen collection too.
Yes, yes.
I would say buy both because you get a lot of really cool Joe Kubert stuff in the Joe Kubert Presents, plus Sam.
Mm-hmm.
But you get all the Stephen stories in the collection, and that's the one you really.
If you'll get that and the a sailor story collection, you've gotten some of the best, Glansman stuff you'll ever see.
Okay.
And there's still a chance that the Lonely War of Willie Schultz will come into print.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm hearing good things that Dark Horses apparently
okay.
Connected themselves with the current effort to get it printed.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen the whole book.
Mm-hmm.
I think Steve has too, with Wayne
yeah.
Van Zandt completing the artwork because, of course, Sam's passed away.
Yeah, I've seen the PDF version.
Yes.
One thing I do want to, as a side note here, for Dell Comics, Glansman illustrated all the combat and air war stories and World War stories issues that were, a lot of them were written by Paul S. Newman, but
actually, I just discovered who wrote the first 4 issues, and I included that at the very last minute.
That's true.
I hope it makes it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But yeah, we have now the complete credits for combat, which we did not have before, except for one instance. I'm not certain who wrote Air War Stories, also wrote issue 5 or 6 of combat.
But those are kind of underappreciated comics too.
I think they're largely unknown, and that's strange because they're excellent stories.
Oh, yes.
Really good ones.
Mm-hmm.
Richard and Stephen, I'm going to slowly start wrapping up because I just want to respect your time.
Well, thank you.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, but thank you very much for your time. I mean, this is.
Hope we've covered everything you were asking or wanted to know.
I'm going to say this is great. It is.
Well, let me
go ahead. There was one thing. You would ask if we had favorite stories, and we actually both included a list of our favorite stories in the book.
Okay. All right.
And it is 45 from each of us, so it's not a short little list. It's a long list.
I can't pick the best one because there's too many good stories.
That's exactly right. We start off with, I think, 30 we were starting off with, and we kept increasing it by 5s every other time we looked at it.
That's the trouble. We start pulling these comics to look at again and going, oh, wow, here's this. Oh, here's that one. And then we, by company, you start pulling the DC, and then you start doing the current, Don Lomax stuff, and all of a sudden you're going, holy cow, you got ECs, you got the DC, you got the Marvel, you got Dell, Charlton, Warren, current stuff, Van Zandt and Lomax and Ennis. And, people, superhero comics are probably, what everyone always is, that's popular.
Yes.
But the war comics, are probably underrated and underappreciated, but there's a growing fan base for them, that's pretty, I don't want to say rabid, but, but they appreciate, they can see that there's so many good stories there and good artists that we have tried to touch on in this book, the ones that are the most influential. So I'm going to toot our own horn here and just say, this is a book that, there's been other books before that might have something about war comics and stuff, but I think we're the ones that have done the first one that really, covers this subject. And like I said, we have enough material for a second book. So if you're listening out there, hint, hint, we hope that someday we'll be able to present that material too, because there's a whole lot more to tell.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yes, Richard.
I would like to, he said everything I want to say about our book itself, but you asked if we had favorite stories. And I have one favorite story that I really wanted to mention. It's outside the purview of this book, and it's a story called Dirty Job. And it's written by Bob Haney and illustrated by Alex Toth. It's 4 pages long, And if you're thinking about, it's in the same category as the USS Stevens stuff. It's 4 pages that packs one hell of a wallop if you read it. And I can't tell you anything more about it than that, because I'll destroy the story if I do.
Well, and in the sense that I remember a story now also outside the purview of war comics, is in the first issue of Impact from EC is the Master Race story illustrated by Bernie Kriegstein. You know,
which is in the book.
Yeah, it's in the book, but
doesn't pervade to the book, but it's in the book because we needed to talk about it.
Yes, it's one of those stories that when you see it and read it, you go, "Wow, this is a masterpiece," and it is.
And unlike most stories, would have to be printed in color or printed in black and white, and they look best one way or the other. You can get something new on that particular story. Whether if you see it in black and white, it shows you something you didn't see before in the color version. You see it in color, you will see something that you didn't have the opportunity to fully understand in the black and white. It's that good.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that beautifully drawn. Beautifully drawn.
Yeah. We hope this book will lead to, people seeking these comics and other books and collections and, creating an interest. I mean, maybe they'll find something that they didn't know they would like till they go and look. So,
and I would like to emphasize that this is the first book-length examination of American war comics.
Yes. And Jason,
nobody's done it before, and that means, yes, we're on the spot for every mistake that we make, and I understand
it's on us.
Every opinion that someone says, well, I don't like that opinion.
Yeah.
I don't care. Write your own book, because that's what we're actively asking people to do.
Yeah.
If you don't like it, get off your butt and write your own book, because I'm sure you'll do a good job too. But the more interest we get in this, the better it is for the field as a whole.
And I'm sure we'll both be writing John Morrow tomorrow and saying thank you. And Jason, I want to say thank you. We really appreciate you contacting us, and letting us talk about this book.
And I've thoroughly enjoyed the talk myself, and I also thank you. And yes, I'll be sending a note to John tomorrow too, saying it went really, really well, and how much I enjoy talking to you.
We hope
done a great job.
Have we answered all your questions? Is there anything you haven't asked yet?
There is one more question before you.
Okay.
A couple of fun questions, because I know Stephen, you met Sam Glasman. Richard, before we started, you said something up Stephen, I want to ask you about this too, or if you have a anecdote of meeting one of the war comic creators. But Richard, you said that you have a very good Joe Kubert anecdote story. Is that correct?
Yeah, like I mentioned, I interviewed Joe about his editorialship, not his actual storytelling, but he was an editor for a long time. And so I took that slant when I interviewed him. It ran in Alter Ego. And one of the things he just finished a book called Dom Z, I believe it's called. I don't pronounce Vietnamese very well, so I'm not certain if that's the correct, but it's DONGXI. And it's a story that takes place before we were fully invested in the Vietnam War. We had advisors over there. And we were going to talk about that. And as he started to talk about it, I said, well, you've actually addressed this same story twice, right? Because you did it in Medal of Honor, which was a Dark Horse book. And he stopped for a second and he said, how the hell did you know that? And I said, well, I read war comics. And from then on, we got along great. There was no hesitation about answering anything because he realized I knew what I was talking about.
Yeah.
He never expected anybody to make the connection between a short story that he did 10 years earlier, 15 years earlier, and the book that he was now putting out. And I think he was startled by it. And I think he kind of liked being startled. And that's a sign of a good person to talk to.
Yes.
Person who can be startled and still go on and keep going. I like that. And I think he liked it too. and over to Steve, and if he's got a story like that.
Oh, okay. Well, like I said, you get to meet your heroes when you start going to conventions and stuff. And, you know, a couple of things that come to mind is the Big Five dinners is, you know, we might be somewhere, you know, eating pizza and sitting next to you is Russ Heath, you know, or we're at another dinner and Russ Heath is sitting there and John Severn is across from you. And they're talking about who's more accurate on their, you know, details when it comes to a Tiger tank or an airplane or something. So they're debating. But, you know, Richard and I both have, you know, gotten to be friends with Sam's widow, or, you know, Sue Glansman. And, you know, she always asks, you know, she'll ask me about Richard, and I'm sure if she talks to Richard, you know, she'll tell him, you know, say hi to Steve. But,
yeah.
You know,
she's a very nice lady.
Very sweet lady. I've been to her, you know, got lucky, went to her house been there a couple of times. And, you know, just the people you get to meet, you know, through all of what, you know, collecting and writing and what we do. I mean, we've gotten, you know, be able to be in touch with these pro artists and writers and people like Roy Thomas and fandom and things like that, you know, and, you know, I've, you know, through comics and paperback books and magazines and movies and all that, it's just, you know, the world has expanded for me because of, you know, all of this. I look back and go, could I have just been an ordinary person who, who, you know, went to work every day and you know, and only watched a few TV shows and you know, just ate nachos and watched football all the time. You know, there's more to life than just that. You know what I mean? And we get to meet people like you, Jason, and we appreciate it.
Yeah. And one last thing.
I mean, this has been fun. Plus, we're not done yet. You know, there's more for us to do together. So.
And one last thing I'd like to point out is that the guy who wrote the introduction for our book is Roy Thomas.
Yes.
Who is my editor and has been for quite a while. And I know you've met him.
Yes.
But he wrote the introduction even though he's written war comics.
Oh, sorry about that.
That's okay. He's written war comics. He wrote Sergeant Fury for a while, but he doesn't like war comics. And he wrote the intro for us anyway, which I thought was really nice.
Yeah.
And the other person who wrote for us for an opening state was Willie Franz, who was ill at the time that he wrote it.
Yeah, his health just isn't good.
And he still came through with an excellent introduction. So I'd like to thank both of them personally too.
Yeah, and John Morrow too, for just, you know, looking at this book and thinking it's very publishable. So you know, we appreciate that. And you know, just, you know, the community of, you know, people that are going to be listening to this too, we hope you've learned something, and I hope they'll you know, want this book. You know.
Yes, buy this book and make us both happy. Yes.
And I was going to say, Jason, I like your T-shirt there. Is there going to be another Maui Comic Con someday?
I'm going to say after, hopefully when COVID's done and everything and mandates are lifted, I would say yes, because Maui Comic Con, they're itching to go. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember
seeing if they do, send us both emails about it so that we can think about going, even if we can't. So.
Yeah, I remember an episode of Hawaii 5-0 where there was a comic convention as part of the storyline. So from several years ago.
Okay. Oh, well, no, I have to look for that episode.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it takes place at the like one of the questions you asked me, have I ever been to Hawaii?
Yes.
And I wrote you back. Yeah, we stayed at the Hilton Hawaiian Village, and I believe you would see that in several episodes of the Hawaii 5-0. They're always by the poolside or something, talking to somebody, but they always use that, the Rainbow Tower there as some backdrop. But yeah, I remember that comic convention being at, one of the buildings there on
Mhm.
on those grounds. So, and I got a question for you. I cannot remember the name of the restaurant that was across the street from the Hilton, but they had the best pancakes.
I'm going to say it because when you wrote that, I'm going to say it was, if I remember hopefully I'm pronouncing it correctly, the Waiao Coffee House.
I
It was
think,
like a small little, it's kind of like a diner type deal.
yeah, but I
Yes.
remember an episode of Hawaii Five-0 that McGarrett, they were in there, and just eating breakfast talking. So I remember that. But anyway, that's just a sidelight here. But
No, actually, um, because that was one of the landmark restaurants in Hawaii.
okay.
Unfortunately, I think 5 years ago they closed down.
Oh,
It was on because of course the they were very they were still they're still making business and so forth, but it's just the cost of everything going up. They just
oh,
couldn't
yeah.
sustain, yeah.
Well, I tell you what, we are jealous that you live in Hawaii, but I know what things cost there too. So, but Richard and I both appreciate you getting in touch with us.
No,
You
thank
know,
you.
Yes,
so thank
very
you.
much so.
Actually, before I wrap up, because couple questions. One to Steve. Steve, how did you and your wife? How did you guys like Hawaii?
Oh, love it, love it. We've only been there twice, but
Mhm.
Maui and Lahaina, we love that. I even drove to Hana, so
Oh yes.
that's interesting.
I'm going to say
And,
it's good that you're able to do it at that time because within the last 2 years, because of cliffside erosions, there's like
oh,
yeah.
oh, that's a beautiful drive, but it's something that she got to see a lot more than I because
Yes.
I was doing the driving, and there's a
Yes.
lot of twists and turns.
Yeah. Hmm.
But yeah, Hawaii is a beautiful, I would love to come back someday. So,
And now to you, Richard, have you and your family, have you guys been to Hawaii?
No, I'm sorry. None of my family has, and I haven't, but I would love to go someday.
Oh,
That's
okay.
why I'm hoping that they'll open up that little Maui convention on your shirt.
Well, the other thing too, I'm going to let you guys know too that um, because I'm just going to try to make this quick, is that within the last 5 years, comic book conventions have started to pop up here in the
Oh,
islands because before
good.
that, it was far and few between.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So like, I think probably within the next 2 years, Amazing Comic Con will hold their comic book conventions again here on Oahu.
Mm-hmm.
Comic Con Honolulu, that's where I met Roy Thomas. We've
Oh,
been doing it for I think the last 5 years. So when things start opening up again, they're going to start that up again. Of course, we got the Maui Comic Con. That's a nice little homegrown, um, grassroots type of comic book convention.
mm-hmm.
And then I know on the Big Island they have their comic book convention there too as well in September. So yeah.
Well,
So
maybe if we're lucky, we'll have a second printing of the book. We'll have to come to Hawaii to promote it.
oh yes.
Or our next book, you never know.
All right. Again, I'm gonna start wrapping this up. Again, if you guys don't mind, can you guys promote your where can listeners find you on social media?
Facebook, okay, that's about, probably the
Facebook
only
for me
one.
too.
Okay.
Hmm.
All right.
So
But I know the book, you can buy it through Amazon
Mhm.
or the Tomorrow's site, or
Mhm.
if they'll contact their, bookshops, comic shops,
Mhm.
and ask, you know.
yes, Cheap Graphic Novels has it on for sale too, for coming out on the 19th. That's
Okay.
where I got that date
Yeah.
from. And Marvel Masterworks also has it listed for sale.
Ah.
So there are online stores that are doing it right now.
Yes. And
And
hopefully,
Bud Plant, I can't forget Bud Plant will
yeah,
be.
Bud Plant, he right now I'm not going to say how many copies, but he told me he's going to be selling a bunch of them. So Bud Plant Art Books is a great website.
Yeah, and it's got everything you ever dreamed of possibly obtaining.
Oh, okay. I gotta remember.
Are you
Never looked at it before, look at it, because others are cheaper or maybe cheaper, but if you want real stuff
Yes.
and the really cool stuff, Bud Plant's the place to go.
Okay.
Yeah.
He does, there'll be sign-in plates, that sort of thing, that you get the autographs and a little tucked away inside the book.
Yes.
There's books that you never see anymore. He's got old stuff that's still as new. That's the cool stuff, is that you can find something that you've wanted to buy for years, you couldn't afford it in 1975, and here it is, and it hasn't been opened.
Yeah. Or you'll see something you didn't know you wanted, and then you realize, oh, I got to get this.
All the time. I get his catalog, and I go through his weekly announcements, and I'm going, man, I wish I had more money. Because there are some really neat stuff all the time. It's rare that you pick up a Bud Plant announcement, a email announcement, or you pick up a catalog and say, boy, that looks good.
Well, Jason, we hope we pointed you and maybe some of the listeners into exploring some books and directions that you hadn't thought of before.
Yes.
So, anyway, anything else you want to ask us?
Last question. Any last words to our listeners?
Richard, why don't you go ahead?
Happy to be talking to people in Hawaii for the first thing.
Yes.
And I hope you enjoy the book if you do get it. And feel free to make online comments or spread the news about it if you feel you do like it, because that's the only real way you can get people to read stuff nowadays.
Yeah.
I mean, just having advertisements that are in the trade papers doesn't do much for the book. It takes word of mouth, and that's an important thing. And word of mouth means, I like this book and you should buy it too.
Yeah, tell your friends.
Exactly.
But also, and I'll add to that, we, appreciate you, Jason, and also for you listeners out there, support your comic shops and the bookstores and the online places where you can buy this book. And we'd like for you, of course, to buy this book, and we think you'll learn something, and you'll see some things you possibly didn't know you wanted to learn. But also, find other, there'll be other, there's a lot more stuff to learn about, these creators that you're going to be reading about.
It's not just buy our book, it's buy their books too, because they have a lot of them, and they're very good books.
Oh, yeah.
You're not going to be disappointed reading anybody we've recommended you to read.
Yeah, any of the, read the EC reprint, of Two-Fisted Tales and Frontline Combat, or, the Garth Ennis stuff, or Wayne Van Zant's Katusha, or Don Lomax's Vietnam Journal. I mean, there's so much good stuff, found, by
and if
those
you can't
people.
afford it, go to your public library and check their lending procedures. Because you can often get the book, maybe it's not in your local library, but they can get the book from somebody in their lending procedure.
Yeah.
And
so
I'll mention
you
this.
can look at too.
Tomorrow's also sells digital copies of their books. So if you can't buy the physical book, you can get the digital one. So anyway, that's all I have to say.
That pretty much does it for me too. So thank you.
No, Richard and Stephen, I wish you guys all the success for your new book. Again, Richard and Stephen, mahalo. Just thank you for your time.
Mahalo to you too.
It's
mahalo
been,
also.
It was an honor, talking to you guys.
I'm waving my thumb and little finger.
Shaka sign.
Yes.
And also, if you are a new reader to comics or a lifelong, comic book fan, please check out our Artists at War, the best of the best American war comic books from Tomorrow's Publishing. It comes out on October 19th. The diamond code is JUL212065. And if you're not too sure, go to the Tomorrow's website. There's preview copies of a few pages from the book to check that out. So I encourage you guys to do that.
And don't forget the Tomorrows is spelled TWO Morrows.
Yes.
Yes.
That makes a big difference when you're looking it up online.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, yes.
Plus, I'll say that ours is going to be a great book, we think, but he publishes so many other great books and magazines. So I want to say John Morrow does a great job.
He has a John Severin book coming out a few months after ours, and I'm looking very much to buying that book.
See, we not only write books, we find books that we want to read. So
I also want to give a big mahalo to John Morrow for helping setting up this interview. So John, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you, John.
And then, I want to thank Drew, the co-host of Comics for Fun and Profit, for putting this episode together. And Drew, thank you for all your hard work behind the scenes. If you are a new listener to the Comics for Fun and Profit podcast, please check out new episodes that comes out every Saturday. And lastly, I want to thank you, the listeners. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening to this episode. Until next time, guys, aloha.
Aloha to you too, Jason.
Aloha.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.